10. Deadly Realtor. A respected realtor from the Ozarks has gotten busted for getting wrapped up in a murder-for-hire plot. Ann Bauman was arrested for hiring a hitman to kill the mother of her ex-husband. According to documents filed with the Camden County Circuit Court, Ann Bauman's motive for hiring the hitman was simple. She believed her ex-husband's mother was responsible for putting strain on the relationship between her and her daughter. She also thought that the woman was going to be taking her to court to try and get full custody of her children. One day when Bauman went to pick up her children, they refused to go with her. She was forced to leave, at which point she sent them a text saying that their grandmother was going to be dead. When the ex-husband confronted Bauman about the text, she simply said it was because the woman was old and would probably die soon. But in reality, she was actively looking for a hitman. The person Bauman went to look for a contract killer has not been named for their own safety. However, the individual did say that if Bauman was serious, they could find a killer for her. But really, the individual was on the phone with their attorney, trying to figure out how to get this woman arrested. She eventually set up a sting operation. Bauman paid a measly $1,500. The witness then went to the cops, and the rest is history. She's now charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and is sitting in court waiting for her sentencing. 9. Russian assassin. 34-year-old Tumso Abdurakhmanov is a well-known blogger from Chechnya who amazingly survived an assassination attempt while in Sweden. Tumso was living in Copenhagen when a man appeared at his apartment with a hammer held in one hand. Apparently, the guy with the hammer had flown from Moscow with the express intention of bludgeoning Tumso to death for being vocal about his anti-Putin stance. While Russia has been accused of secretly assassinating a whole lot of people recently, most of these assassinations involve nerve gas or poisoning. This one was just an ordinary guy with a hammer. But here's where the hitman really messed up. He wasn't very good at his job. The blogger, after being hit in the neck several times with a hammer, got the weapon away from the guy. He then bludgeoned the hitman with his own hammer, beating him to within an inch of his life in front of his apartment door. It was a total fail on the part of the hitman. He even admitted that he had been sent from Moscow to take care of Tumso. When the police got to the scene, they discovered the gruesome spectacle of two Russian citizens covered in blood from the vicious battle with a hammer. The bigger man, the man who had broken into Tumso's apartment, had already slipped into unconsciousness. Both were arrested. After 3 days of police questioning, Tumso was reclassified as a crime victim, and the other man, 29-year-old Ruslan Mamiev, was detained on suspicion of attempted murder. 8. The Florida Escort. Dalia Dipolito was sentenced to spend 16 years in prison back in 2017. The sentence came after she was found guilty of soliciting murder. She was recorded on video and audio freely plotting to kill her husband, Michael Dipolito. At the time, she had been married to him for only 6 months. The assassination attempt was in 2009. It took 11 years for her to finally be sentenced, although she did get time served since she had already been locked up that whole time. But let's back it up to when she tried to hire a hitman. Dalia agreed to pay an undercover officer $7,000 to have her husband knocked off. When asked if she was sure that she wanted him killed, she said she was 5,000% sure. She plotted with the undercover officer to make it look like a burglary gone wrong. Her husband was supposed to be killed while she was out at the gym. How did the undercover officer get involved in all this? Dalia had originally approached her ex-boyfriend to see if he could source a hitman. Instead of doing that, he went straight to the police, who helped set up the sting operation. 7. Outsourcing. Authorities in China have charged 6 men with crimes of intentional homicide. According to the officials, all 6 individuals had tried outsourcing the killing of one target to another hitman. In other words, One individual hired a hitman to kill somebody. The hitman he hired outsourced the killing to another hitman, and so on and so forth. It went on down the line until 5 hitmen were involved. All 5 of the hitmen were sentenced to spend between 2 and 4 years in prison, while the guy at the top of the pyramid who requested the hit in the first place was given 5 years. The man behind it all is a real estate developer named Ton Huey. In 2013, he decided he wanted to kill his rival developer. It was all about a dispute regarding a development project. Ton paid a man somewhere around $280,000 to complete the job. Now, if you ask us, that sounds like real hitman money. That's the kind of cash that will get you Agent 47 showing up to do the job. The hitman took the money, then used half of it to hire a cheaper hitman. He paid the cheaper hitman only $38,000 up front, with the promise of $71,000 when the job was done. And we keep going down the line. The job was offered to a third man for even less money. It was kicked down the line to the 4th, then finally to the 5th. The very last hitman was promised $14,000 in total to do the job. Through all this outsourcing, the police caught on to the scheme, came cracking down on everybody, and the hit was never carried out. Talk about some seriously lazy killers. 6. The Dark Web Preacher. In Minnesota, a preacher was stuck in a failing marriage. His name is Stephen Allwine, and he was recently on trial for premeditated first-degree murder. The preacher tried to hire a hitman on the dark web using Bitcoin, but his plan fell apart. Unlike most of the other failed murder plots we heard about today, this guy actually took the murder into his own hands. He killed his wife, Amy Allwine, and then tried to make it look like she had killed herself. She was found dead on November 13, 2016. They had been married for decades after originally meeting at a Christian college. They were active church members and had an adopted son together. So what went wrong? Stephen had served as the church elder. He was a deacon, and he even offered marriage counseling. He seemed like a perfectly ordinary guy, but when he learned about the site called Ashley Madison, where people can sign up to have affairs, the Holy Spirit left his body. According to Fox News, the preacher had affairs with at least 2 women. But then when the breach in security caused all the Ashley Madison users to be outed, the preacher decided it was time to kill his wife before she found out about his affairs. Where does a person go when they need a hitman? The dark web. The preacher found a shady hitman on the site and paid him $6,000 in Bitcoin. But then the hitman conveniently vanished, and the preacher was stuck doing the murder himself. Do you know anyone who's ever tried to do something strange on the dark web? Let us know your stories in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe before the end of the video. 5. The Doctor and the Hells Angels. A doctor has been accused of hiring the legendary biker gang known as the Hells Angels to get rid of a witness. This witness knew all about the doctor improperly prescribing opioids to his patients. The doctor's name is Anatoly Brailovsky, and he was in some serious hot water because of the allegations against him. While waiting to go on trial for writing fraudulent prescriptions, he turned to the Hells Angels. He asked if they could murder the witness before he had the chance to testify against the doctor. If the one witness is suddenly dead, though, doesn't that make the doctor look even more suspicious? What do you think? But guess what? This time, the Hells Angels weren't really feeling like murder. Somebody, we don't know if it was actually one of the angels, contacted the FBI after the doctor came looking for a killer. The unnamed informant, with help from the FBI, set up a sting operation. He met the FBI agent at the local Home Depot, where in the parking lot they discussed murder. However, this case is a little different. The doctor didn't trust the undercover agent. He never explicitly requested that he commit murder for money. He also never exchanged any money for the service. So now he's facing a kind of gray area crime in which he did seek a hitman, but didn't actually go through with it. Nonetheless, when added to the fraud charges, he's looking at some serious time behind bars. 4. Italian Black Widow. Patricia Reggiani, known to some as the Black Widow, was found guilty of paying a hitman somewhere around $300,000 in 1995 to murder Maurizio Gucci, the heir to a fashion empire. Maurizio had left Patrizia for another woman. Not only that, he was seeing several other women as well. She was so angry that he had betrayed her, and she wanted more than the measly $650,000 that he offered in the divorce settlement. So she went around asking everyone she could if they knew someone who was brave enough to murder her husband. She claims she couldn't aim a gun very well. Otherwise, she would have done it herself. Eventually, she came across a hitman named Benedetto Cirolo, the owner of a pizzeria who was in serious debt. She paid him a huge sum of money to shoot her ex-husband dead, and he did it too. He shot him on the steps of his office in Milan. It was right after he was going to work, with the pizzeria owner appearing out of nowhere and pulling the trigger. But amazingly, even after the pizzeria owner was caught, he kept his mouth shut. It took the police 2 years to finally figure out that it had been Patricia Reggiani who ordered the hit. She ultimately served 18 years in prison, being released in October of 2014. 3. Ranch hand assassin. An animal rights lawyer recently pled guilty to offering somebody $100,000 to kill her ex-husband's girlfriend. And to make the story even more bizarre, the animal rights attorney sought the help of a simple ranch hand to do the murder. The lawyer's name is Jennifer Emmy from Evergreen in Colorado. At the time of the murder-for-hire plot, she was locked in a desperate divorce battle with her ex-husband. Jennifer was 43 years old, but her husband, Donnie Emmy, had run away with a significantly younger girl who had been working for them as an au pair. An au pair is someone like a live-in nanny who lives in the house and takes care of the kids and does the chores. Literally every wife's worst nightmare. As you can probably imagine, Jennifer was heartbroken. Her husband ditched her for the younger nanny. Furious and angry, she lost her marbles. She went to a ranch hand that she knew named Timothy Lindsay. Timothy told her it would cost $100,000 to hire a contract killer. They then discussed the killings in detail, with Jennifer having some pretty intense ideas. She wanted the girlfriend to be killed in a car accident, preferably with her ex-husband in the vehicle at the time. But instead of doing it, the ranch hand got in contact with the police. Jennifer was arrested for attempting to hire a hitman, and now she's locked up for good. 2. Insurance fraud. Alex Murdaugh hired a hitman for himself. In a bizarre case of insurance fraud, Alex paid a contract killer to murder him by surprise. That way his family would get the death insurance payout. Now you're probably wondering why on earth a person would do that. Alex had once been an ordinary member of society, but his life spiraled out of control after his wife and son were murdered, and he got horribly addicted to opioids. It didn't help that before that, his son was responsible for a boat accident that saw an innocent woman get killed. Talk about bad luck. Basically, his life went from awesome to garbage. With most of his family dead and only one son alive, Alex was absolutely miserable. He hatched the scheme to be murdered by a hitman so that his only remaining son could collect $10 million from his life insurance policy. That is a huge chunk of money to leave behind as inheritance, but the plot was a failure. The guy that Alex hired to assassinate him refused to do it. Instead of giving his son all that money, Alex is now being brought up on charges of fraud. 1. Hitman fake out. Ramon Sosa from Houston, Texas was almost killed by his wife when she hired a hitman to take him out. And to add insult to injury, his wife had actually hired a former client of Ramon's to do the job for a measly $2,000. The story goes back to 2013, when Ramon's wife, Lulu, was granted U.S. citizenship and moved from Mexico City to Texas. But for one reason or another, she didn't really like her husband. She was amazing while they were dating, then became a completely different person once she was in the country. Ramon became aware of her plot to murder him after a friend of his told on her. His friend, an ex-gang member, was the one Lulu had gone to offer the $2,000. The pair took their evidence to the police, who then helped Ramon fake his own death. They staged a photo shoot in which Ramon lay in a grave with a fake bullet hole in the center of his head, appearing dead as a doornail. Next, Ramon went into hiding for 3 days. When an undercover FBI agent made contact with Lulu, he showed her the photos of her supposedly dead husband. She simply laughed. It was clear she had been trying to murder him, and so she was arrested. She's currently serving 20 years in an American jail.
Number 10. The first homicide of 2022. New York City had its first homicide of 2022 when a woman was stabbed to death in Queens. It happened on January 1st when an unidentified woman was discovered lying on the sidewalk near Broadway in Astoria with several stab wounds. She died after being brought to the hospital, but the circumstances around her death remain a complete mystery. There were no witnesses, there are no suspects, and not even the victim has been properly identified yet. But here's where things get really alarming. The first homicide of 2022 was in the early morning hours of the first day of the year. This doesn't bode well for the next 12 months. According to the New York Post, 2021 recorded 485 murders. That was a sharp increase from the murders seen in 2020. If the city continues to experience murder at such an alarming rate, 2022 will be a bloody time for the city. And although 485 does feel like a lot of murder for one city, it's nothing compared to the 1990s. In the first year of that decade, there were 2,245 murders recorded in just 365 days. New York City was a literal battleground in the 90s, and the number of homicides has dropped off significantly since then. Even though it may seem wildly dangerous from the outside, it's way better than it used to be. In 1990, there were 6.15 murders each day. Number 9. Run over in the Bronx. Molly Pearson, a 24-year-old from New York City, was run over by a box truck in Brooklyn. She was riding a moped at about 11 o'clock in the morning when the box truck came roaring through an intersection of Meeker and Skillman and drove over her like she was a squirrel hopping across the road. According to the police investigation, both the truck driver and the young woman were turning right at the same time, but the truck was way bigger than Molly's scooter, and it swept her underneath it. The driver didn't even realize what was happening until he was already running the woman over and crushing her bones with his truck's huge tires. Paramedics arrived on the scene as quickly as possible. Molly was rushed to the hospital, but there was nothing doctors could do to save her. The weight of the truck rolling over her and her moped was just too great. She was like a tree branch thrown into a series of crunching gears. As for the driver, no arrest has been made yet. It seems to have been an accident, but really highlights how horribly dangerous driving in the big city can be. Number 8. The Jogger Predator. Chanel Lewis was only 22 years old when he killed New York jogger Karina Vetrano. As Karina was jogging along a park trail near her home in Howard Beach, Queens, Chanel snuck up behind her and took her life. He has now finally been sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison with no possibility of parole. But it took 2 dramatic trials for a sentence to finally be passed down. One of the major problems was that Lewis continued to say that he was innocent and never deviated from his story. The first trial ended in a hung jury, so they had to have a whole new trial. But this time, it only took 5 hours for the jury to get on board and convict this guy of murder and sexual assault. Karina was a speech pathologist. She left her home just after 5:30 in the evening to go for a usual jog along Spring Creek Park. Surveillance footage caught her running down the road, but that was the last time she was ever seen alive. Minutes later, she was punched in the face, dragged through a thick tangle of weeds, violently assaulted, and then strangled to death. Chanel Lewis left her in the bushes for the bugs and animals to ravage. She was discovered face down in the dirt 4 hours later. Number 7. Pushed onto the tracks. A New York City homeless man has been charged with murdering a woman at a subway station. The victim, 40-year-old Michelle Alyssa Go, was waiting for the southbound R train at 9:40 a.m. when the attack happened. The homeless man approached Michelle, gave her a hard shove just as the train was coming, and she was obliterated instantly. According to New York Police Department Commissioner Keegan Sewell, the incident was unprovoked and the victim hadn't even interacted with the killer. It was completely random and spontaneous. The killer, later identified by the cops as 61-year-old Simon Martial, fled the scene as quick as he could, but later turned himself over to the transit police. He's been charged with murder, but when we look at his rap sheet, it doesn't come as a huge surprise. Simon was homeless. He often loitered in New York City's dank subway stations, and the police knew of his vast criminal history. He had multiple prior arrests. He was on parole at the time of the killing, and the cops had already documented at least 3 emotionally disturbed encounters with the man. Clearly, he was not somebody who should have been free to roam the subway stations, where people can so easily be pushed in front of the trains. Number 6. One embarrassed daughter. Boston mom Beth Davis was so desperate to get her daughter a date that she put up a billboard in Times Square. The sign, which was absolutely massive, read, "Date my daughter." And of course, it was accompanied by a picture of her 30-year-old daughter, Molly. It even had a link to her dating profile. If you thought one or two of your friends seeing your dating profile by accident was embarrassing, imagine the entirety of New York City seeing a billboard put up by your mother. According to Beth, she put up the billboard because she's desperate for her daughter to find love before she dies. Sadly, Beth was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer in 2020, and it has already spread into her bones. She may not be around much longer, and she wants to see her daughter settle down with a wonderful man before her time comes. As for Molly, she's taking it all in stride. The one thing that's for sure is that if Molly was having a hard time finding a date before, she shouldn't now. Literally everyone in New York City has a direct link to her dating profile. What would your reaction be if your mom plastered your face on a billboard in the middle of Times Square just so you could get a date? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe before the end of the video. Number 5. The worst NYPD officer. A man from New York City, a former NYPD officer, has been charged for the murder of his own mother. As if matricide wasn't bad enough, he attacked her with a machete to the point that he nearly cut her head clean off. According to the district attorney, her head was hanging on barely by a thread by the time he was done. This is the worst NYPD officer ever, at least when it comes to motherly abuse. His name was Osvaldo Diaz, 46 years old. The attack took place inside the apartment he was sharing with his mom, above a beauty salon in Queens. It was Osvaldo's sister who came across the murder scene. She was supposed to go out with their mother, but she wasn't answering her calls. Worried, she got the landlord to let her into the apartment. That was when she found her mom wrapped in a bloody sheet. Her brother had already fled. It looked like he quit halfway through trying to dispose of the body and made a break for it. The killer went on the run for a week before he was finally apprehended in New Jersey. But he never has given a motive for why he tried to decapitate his mom. He stuck to his innocence this whole time, claiming the police have the wrong guy. But according to the victim's family, he was known for outbursts of violence. Nobody is all that surprised that he finally killed someone. Number 4. Murder at Burger King. In New York City, nobody wants to work the night shift. 19-year-old Crystal Byron Neves was one of these people. She was extremely nervous to begin working night shifts at Burger King. She asked the manager if she could work days because she was worried about her safety, but she was told to suck it up in so many words. Just after she started work, Crystal was the victim of a mad gunman. He walked into the fast food restaurant at about 1 o'clock in the morning on January 9th, pointed the gun, and demanded cash. This is according to the New York City Police Department. The teenager got the key to open the cash register. She handed the guy $100, and then he pulled the trigger anyway. He blasted the girl in the torso, turning her insides into scrambled eggs. He also pistol-whipped a male customer and punched the manager in the face before fleeing. The murderer was arrested soon after, a man named Winston Glynn, but the teen didn't make it. She was rushed to the local hospital and pronounced dead. In this shocking and terrifying case, the girl's worst nightmare actually came true. Number 3. Killer NYC teen. A teenager from New York City has been given 14 years to life in prison for the brutal murder of a student, Tessa Majors. Rashawn Weaver was only 14 years old when he and 2 other teenage friends tried to rob Tessa as she walked through Manhattan's Morningside Park back in December of 2019. It was only supposed to be a robbery, but it got completely out of hand. Rashawn ended up stabbing the young woman to death over her iPhone. During court proceedings, it was revealed how Tessa held onto her iPhone for dear life when Rashawn and his friends tried to take it from her. It's not the victim's fault that she was stabbed to death, but she may have gotten away alive if she had just given up her phone. Instead, she clung to the thing as if it were her baby, and to lose it would be to lose a piece of her soul. But according to her family, there was a good reason Tessa didn't want to give up her phone. It contained all the songs she'd been recording on it for the past 3 years. The songs were stored nowhere else but on her phone. So in a way, losing her phone really would have been like losing a legitimate piece of her soul. In the end, Tessa lost her phone and her life. And it gets even more horrifying. Rashawn Weaver and his friends had set out that night intent on mugging someone in the park. They tried a few times, but failed. Finally, they set their sights on a single woman jogging by herself. Rashawn ran up behind her, kicked her in the back, and then screamed at her as she lay on the ground in pain. When she didn't give up the phone, he pulled out a knife and stabbed her 4 times. Each time, he thrust the knife with enough force to push feathers out of her coat to float off in the night air. Number 2. Bad Brooklyn Funeral Home. One woman in Brooklyn is suing a local funeral home for mishandling her dead mom's body. Her name is Dawn Morales, and she says that she paid R.G. Ortiz Funeral Home to cremate her mother, but she never received the ashes. This is because the funeral home accidentally buried her mom on Hart Island in the Potter's Field, a gravesite reserved for unclaimed bodies. Naturally, Dawn is devastated. She told local news that the funeral home treated her mother like nobody. They literally buried her in the worst place imaginable, a neglected gravesite filled with nameless, unclaimed corpses, like those the police find floating in the river. When Dawn reached out to the funeral home, she didn't get many answers. It wasn't until she made a huge stink about it that they finally agreed to get the body back and properly cremate it. But after 4 months, she has still not received the ashes of her mother. If you ask me, this is a perfect example of just how chaotic and crazy life in New York City can be. They can't even keep track of their dead. Number 1. The Times Square Killer. Richard Francis Cunningham is also known as the Times Square Torso Ripper, or just the Times Square Killer. He was a savage serial killer from between 1967 and 1980, murdering a minimum of 11 young women and girls. He earned his nickname after leaving 2 of his victims dismembered and decapitated in a hotel just beside Times Square. This was in December of 1979. He picked up Dita Goodzari, a sex worker in her 20s, and a teenage girl who has still never been identified. He took them to the hotel, tortured them, and then cut off their heads and hands and set their bodies on fire. He fled the scene with the heads and hands, which police have still never recovered. This was one of the sickest guys who ever existed, and yet nobody has ever heard of him. Guys like Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy get all the attention, but Richard Cunningham really was a devil in New York City. He was finally caught on May 22, 1980. The cops found him in a New Jersey hotel, in the middle of torturing a teenage girl whom he'd lured from NYC. The cops caught him in the act and locked him up. He was convicted of 5 murders, although he's confessed to somewhere between 85 and 100. He's actually still alive, currently incarcerated in the Southwood State Prison in New Jersey.
Number 10. A bad delivery. A California woman was killed by her ex-boyfriend as she was trying to deliver food for DoorDash. It was a Sunday afternoon in Milpitas, and Christina Raymond was going about her life as normal. She was on the phone with her boyfriend, Leonard Pearson, when she became aware that somebody was following her. She tried to figure out who it was, and eventually managed to catch a glimpse of the man in her rearview mirror. She was shocked to see that it was her ex, 42-year-old Anthony John Juco. Anthony just so happens to be a registered sex offender in the state of California. Obviously, he's not the kind of guy you want to be followed by. Understanding that she could be in danger, Christina drove to the police station, but she pulled up and stopped on the wrong side of the building. At this point, Anthony was able to catch up to her. She thought she was safe parked outside of a cop station, but not so much. Anthony got into her car and stabbed her repeatedly until she was dead. The cops only figured out what was happening when they received a call from a concerned party who said Christina should have arrived at the police station. When they went outside the wrong end of the building, they saw Anthony pulling out of the parking lot in Christina's vehicle. They then got into a high-speed chase. The chase ended with Anthony crashing. The police rounded the vehicle, arrested the maniac, and discovered Christina's corpse, mutilated in the back seat. Number 9. Killing the whole family. In an insane fit of rage after being dumped, a man from Oshawa, Ontario, beat a woman to death and killed her 2 kids. This is one of the most horrendous things you're probably going to hear today, so nobody's judging if you get a bit queasy. 39-year-old Krashimira Pejanovsky, her 15-year-old son Roy, and a 13-year-old daughter, Finalia, were all brutally slaughtered. The man responsible is Corey Fenn, who has since pleaded not guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder, but he's definitely guilty. There's no doubt about it. Corey Fenn was dating Krashimira on and off again for quite some time, but she finally worked up the courage to call it off and break all ties with the man. This pushed Corey into such a horrible rage that he went out and purchased himself as much cocaine as he could afford. At least, that's what he says. He claims that the drugs sent him into a cocaine psychosis. All jacked up, he drove to his ex-girlfriend's house and beat her until she wasn't recognizable anymore. Then, still possessed by his bloodthirst, he attacked her son and strangled him on the floor of a bedroom. Then he stalked down the stairs to the basement and stabbed the 13-year-old girl to death. The only inconsistency in this story is that Corey was on cocaine. No physical evidence was found that he was intoxicated at the time of the murders. Crown attorney Mike Newell told the court that the brutality of Corey's attack shows his intent to kill. He went into the house to murder, and that's exactly what he did. Number 8. Abandoned in a rural field. Hunter Van Mackelberg was 19 years old when he killed Calix Langenau. It was a classic case of teenage love affair gone horribly wrong. The story starts in 2017 when Hunter was dating a girl named SB and Calix was dating a girl named Madeline. But by the summer of 2018, the couple had split apart and switched. The 2 teenage boys only knew each other because they were dating one another's ex. It was a pretty normal situation for teenagers to be in. Throughout 2019 and 2020, as Calix continued to date SB, Hunter became increasingly jealous and angry. Calix had the windows of his car shot out, and he thought that Hunter and Madeline were responsible. It became clear the couple was out to get him. He became so afraid for his life that he took a job in a different province because he needed to get out of town. In February of 2020, Calix and SB were broken up, but Hunter and Madeline were now living together. On Valentine's Day, Calix must have been feeling lonely. He reached out to his ex-girlfriend, Madeline. They made plans to meet up at the local Costco parking lot at 1:30 in the morning. They met, but Hunter had followed his girlfriend there. Hunter forced Calix to get behind the wheel and drive them to a rural field. Once there, Hunter killed Calix execution style with a 12-gauge shotgun for trying to mess around with his girl. Calix must have thought he was reconnecting with his ex, but the truth was that she helped orchestrate his brutal murder. It was all just one big, cruel attack. Number 7. Held hostage. A woman in Portland was killed by her ex-boyfriend after he escaped from federal custody and went on a mad rampage. Her name was Mariela Gonzalez Rocha. She was discovered dead in her apartment after a bizarre standoff with the police, in which her ex shot over 30 rounds at officers from inside the apartment. Mariela called the police at about 3:30 in the afternoon and claimed she was being held hostage in her own apartment. The dispatcher heard her pleading to someone to leave her alone, and then a male picked up the phone. The guy said his name was Jason, that the woman they just talked to was high on drugs, and that nobody had any guns. The call then ended abruptly. This was way too suspicious for police not to report to the scene. It also helped that a few minutes later, neighbors in the same apartment complex began calling the cops when they heard gunshots going off. For 10 hours, the cops tried to get into the apartment. They broke the windows, they tried using a robot, and they threw in tear gas. The escaped ex-boyfriend, Devontae Donahue, had gunned down Mariela before the police ever managed to get inside. They found her lying face down on the floor, dead from a single gunshot. And all because her ex-boyfriend managed to wiggle his way out of a Portland Federal Reentry Center. He was doing 9 years in prison for sex trafficking a minor. but when he was transferred, he managed to escape by cutting off his GPS ankle bracelet and making a break for it. Number 6. Shot in the back. Eva Morera Ulloa was shot in the back by her ex-boyfriend. According to the Costa Rica police, her body was discovered in the town of Barva de Heredia just hours before they arrested the prime suspect. Eva was a student, she was a young mother, and she was a vocal activist involved in bringing more attention to victims of gender violence. You might say she was a pretty good person, but all that came to an end at the hands of a man she had dated. It's sadly ironic that Eva was searching for a way to end femicides in Costa Rica, then became the victim of one herself. Her killer is Randall Garrida Oviedo, and he's since been sentenced to 35 years in prison. It's been difficult to pin down a precise motive for the killing. The plaintiff lawyer involved in the case said that Randall had established psychological entrapment of Eva, but that influence ended after they broke up. The most likely scenario is that Randall was upset and jealous that his girlfriend was able to move on without him, and so he did the only thing he could think of. He removed her from the world forever. Number 5. The worst anesthetist. An anesthetist from Baltimore made a terrifying confession on Facebook after shooting his ex-girlfriend in the head. His name was Ray J. Black, and he had worked as a nurse practitioner anesthetist until just before the murders. He was fired for a workplace dispute. It was from there that his life kind of spiraled out of control. He took to Facebook Live to announce to the entire world that he had just killed his ex-girlfriend, Tara LeBang, and that he was going after his ex-wife next. In his horrifying confession, he said shooting his ex in the head felt like a dream and that he never thought he would be that guy. He then said that since he started, he might as well finish it. The next person that made him really depressed in his life was his ex-wife. As he recorded the video, he was standing in front of his ex-wife's house. He showed her front porch. She could be seen opening the door and then quickly closing it, and then he went in for the kill. He forced his way into her house. Before the video ended, his last words heard were, "Today's the day." Seconds later, his ex-wife Wendy was dead. Is this the most disturbing thing you've ever heard being live streamed on Facebook? If you know anything worse that happened on Facebook Live, be sure to mention it in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Number 4. The Last Red Light. A jealous man in North Philadelphia convinced 2 of his friends to assassinate his ex-girlfriend. Chong Lin Dan was arrested and charged with being the mastermind behind the murder plot that saw Ebony Pack, a 30-year-old nurse, get gunned down at a red light in Lansdale in November of 2020. He didn't pull the trigger himself. Cowardly convinced 2 of his friends to do it for him. According to the girl Ebony started seeing after she dumped Chong, he was verbally and physically abusive throughout their relationship. This is partly why it ended in July of 2020. After Ebony started seeing the new girl, Chong became extremely jealous. He was angry, he threatened her, and he plotted to kill her. Chong had his friends Vance and Dan, along with a third gunman, as she was driving to her girlfriend's house in Landale. When she got to the stoplight, they pulled up beside her and opened fire. When the police tried to track these guys down, 2 had vanished. They managed to arrest Vance and charge him with murder, but the others had already gotten on a flight to Honduras and have yet to return to the States. A warrant for their arrest has been issued, but the cops haven't been able to find any information as to their whereabouts. Right now, Chong and Vance are the only ones in custody. Number 3. Left in a suitcase. Valerie Reyes was stuffed in a suitcase and then dumped in the woods and left to suffocate. It was her ex-boyfriend, Javier de Silva Rojas, who committed the despicable crime. To understand what happened, we need to go back to January of 2018. The pair met on the internet and started dating. They had an affair for about 3 months, but it ended because Javier was more interested in being romantic than Valerie was. This led to tension between them because he wanted things to get serious, and she just wanted to mess around. The 2 broke up, and Javier became depressed. On January 30th, 2019, Valerie didn't show up to work. She hadn't been seen for 2 days, and people were worried. She was working her dream job at a bookstore in New York, while Javier worked at a restaurant as an illegal immigrant whose visa expired. On February 5th, Valerie's corpse was discovered by some highway workers in Connecticut. They found a red suitcase in the forest about 20 feet from the road with her mangled body inside of it. She had been bound with duct tape and beaten, but was still alive when left in the woods. She died a slow and agonizing death in that suitcase, all because Javier was distraught that she no longer wanted to see him. Number 2. Thanksgiving Day killing. On Thanksgiving Day, a woman in Madison County, an advocate for the victims of domestic violence, became a victim herself. A call came into the sheriff's office at about 1 p.m. in the afternoon, reporting a possible death. When first responders and deputies arrived at the address, they discovered Leslie Reeves and Christopher J. Smith shot and bleeding on the floor. Smith suffered injuries and was rushed to the hospital but survived, while Leslie was pronounced dead on the spot. Leslie was a respected member of the community. She operated a small business in which she taught women to do yoga, to stay fit, and to practice self-defense. The investigation into her death revealed that her ex-boyfriend, Robert Tarr, had been harboring some animosity against the woman. He's currently on trial for her murder. During the most recent court appearance, it came out that Robert had texted a close friend that he suspected Leslie was on a date with a dude. Eyewitnesses say his vehicle was spotted several times moving between his home, about an hour away, and the place where Leslie was murdered. It seems that he had followed her on a date she was having with a man, then broke into the house and killed her, execution style. Before he fled the house, he turned the gun on her date and tried to kill him too. The date, Christopher Smith, is still in the hospital in serious condition. The trial for Robert Tarr is also still ongoing. Right now, he's sitting in jail waiting for a decision to be made in February. His fate now lies in the hands of a jury. And number 1, failed property dispute. Wajiha Swati was a citizen of the United States of America of Pakistani origin. She went to Pakistan in the middle of October to settle a property dispute that she was having with her ex-husband, Rizwan Habib. The day she arrived in the city, Rizwan picked her up from the airport, but he never took her to the hotel or somewhere to settle the dispute. He instead abducted her with the help of his father and a third man. Together, they brutally murdered the woman and ditched her corpse at a house owned by one of Rizwan's employees. It's not clear what the property dispute was exactly, but we now know it was more of an excuse for her ex-husband to get her out of the U.S. to Pakistan. She fell for the trick and was killed on the same day she arrived. The cops eventually found her body in the house. They connected the 3 men to the murder, and they've all been arrested. Thanks for watching. What's the worst situation you've ever been in with an ex? Let us know the chilling details in the comments. And remember to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Come back soon for more shocking videos. See you next time.